Okay, this lesson, I am Cornet.org, the apologetic and outreach ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. We gather faithfully in Jacksonville, Arkansas at 2200 Marshall Road, and we gather for the full purpose to provoke each other into love and unto good works. So the outreach ministry, especially when I happened upon Biblicists and they fell in the category Baptist, which even that, they explained that that had been an accusation because they had historically practiced baptism. They preach the gospel and baptize those who believe it without license from the church. From a church, state church, or from the state. And of course, in this country, we don't know what that means to have a state-church relationship at all. And that's one of the reasons why I'm quite impressed with people who say they're neither Catholic nor Protestant, because you have to say, well, what do they know? And then when they say, well, neither are we Judaic or Islamic or cultic or New Age, and I said, well, which denomination? Well, we're not of that either. And they explained to me what ecclesia was. They explained to me the history of the Lord's churches, the prevalence. So I was really struck and impressed that these people could say, ecclesiastically speaking, that they aren't of the Protestant nor Catholic tradition. Of course, Protestants aren't Catholic, and Catholic aren't Protestant, so you're kind of seeing the obvious now. But when they told me then they weren't Calvinist nor Arminian, I soon learned that these people must know something, because without knowledge, and if you're not a Biblicist, you have to be a Calvinist, or you have to be an Arminian or Lutheran or Molinist. As people have expressed in our feedback, you have to fall into one camp or the other. Well, why would they say that? There is a rationale for it. And again, when I met people, and then you learn and find out who the subject matter experts are, who have the specialized knowledge, who's trained in languages, who's trained in hermeneutics, who's trained in systematic theology. Then you move closer, and the way the seminary curriculum was designed, you start very rudimentary level, and then you advance as you grow, or should grow, and as it's expected in the design curriculum for you to develop along the way. So that by the time you're in, let's say, systematic theology or graduate level, doing hermeneutics, using Bible languages, you really can see now why so many people, and I specifically mentioned the ones who fall in that category of Baptist, because they're maligned historically by Protestant and Catholic alike. Now, we don't experience that here. Now, I'm sure someone on the internet, whatever that might mean, but we freely go and assemble and in the shadow of the C-130 Air Base here at the Little Rock Air Force Base in Jacksonville, Arkansas. No one even throws tomatoes at us, or even tomatoes. So we don't really know what that would be like to live in a hostile community, hostile against any particular religion. It's a pluralistic society, very diverse, multicultural, and that's because of the dynamics of the military base. But why is it people still have to be certain things? Well, because without a knowledge, for example, of what is a church letter, what is a church, it leaves people. For example, the controversy about election, for example, you're presented with either it's corporate or personal or individual, something like that. Well, you'll notice what's missing. Well, what's the definition, class, of the word elect? It's a transliteral term, and the verb is legomai, however you want to pronounce that. So that verbal of logos is reason, rationale, out from, reasoned out. But then what more do we know? Well, we have another, with knowledge, we know that instead of just saying corporate or personal, we notice ecclesiastic. And we can go to the church letter, for example, the one written to Ephesus, and we notice in verse 4 where Paul said he chose us in him before the foundation of the world. And of course, you all know in this class that word foundation is not the same as the one in the book of Hebrews, where it says laying, again, a foundation, because the word laying there is the same word in Ephesians 1:4. And then when Paul said us, the antecedent to that pronoun, he was referring to those baptized Jews, those apostles reasoned out, because later he then goes to second person. He said, well, who would know all that? Exactly, a Biblicist would. So that when you're left with the only options presented you, such as corporate or individual election, then we'll read the church letter, the Apocalypse of John, the Revelation. It speaks of those in those churches as the called, the chosen, and the faithful. So there's your trifecta. Not everyone was called, not everyone of those called was chosen, and not everyone chosen is faithful. And yet to those in that particular context, it speaks of people who were all of that. And that's the ideal, and that's exactly why, as a Biblicist, you can know that. So here I'll just give you a couple of examples, excellence in Biblicism, and examples, open or closed theism, or the Bible. Now, those of you that have been studying this class, you immediately say living, and to leave living out of theism would be like, to me, a Biblicist, it'd be like leaving the Trinity out of the Godhead. So that's enough said. And then young or old earth ageism. Now, first, don't take that too seriously and beat yourself up, because I know that there are even people, seminary professors, that have switched sides between this. We were taught in seminary as early as 1987, the first time I attended, and we were told how people just swing back and forth like a pendulum, you know. Here, I don't have one, but this T-square, you know, all they can do is just swing back and forth. That's really all they can do, because that's the only option presented. But now, as a Biblicist, you can definitely know much more. You can notice the difference between duration and decay. You can notice the difference between when something was created, and then you can notice the growth rate as opposed to the accelerated decay rate. You can even use numbers in the Bible. And again, this is just if you're interested in the subject. Now, if you just want to pick, like I said, if somebody's buying my lunch and they're an old earther, then my goodness, I do want to hear what people say. Then usually, though, I find out they're not really an old earther, meaning they're usually finished talking when they say the title of the position that they prefer. Young earther, same thing. Most people just say it and move on. They don't really study for themselves. But again, if you're not a Biblicist, you have to be one of these. You have to be a Calvinist or Arminian. Similar to, as I use the curious case of Dr. Leighton Flowers of Soteriology 101, I'm very intrigued by the young man there, the gentleman, and I'm very intrigued by the fact that he was once a Calvinist by his own testimony. But instead of returning to Arminianism, he stopped. He said he just stopped this little swing back and forth, back and forth. And as one seminary professor told me directly, that between Calvinism and Arminianism, this thing cycles. Well, he meant that thing that we were always warned about. Well, not warned, but informed and given a heads up and made aware of. But what Dr. Leighton Flowers did, which is so intriguing, because why don't people do it? So he started Soteriology 101. He has his own term, provisionism. He has his own acronym, provide, as opposed to tulip or daisy. And anyway, it's very impressive to see someone prefer to bother to study for themselves. And I was quite disappointed in the Southern Baptist Convention, that is the whole system, because with that kind of resource, that kind of scholarship, subject matter experts, even the finances, the money, the efficiency and the effectiveness of that organization. Now, whatever you want to call it, but then for them to let's say as an organization, for them to move, and whatever happens to one happen to all, and they to go between Calvinism and Arminianism, and it was quite it was not indicative of what they could have done. And what Soteriology 101, for example, is what you could do. You could stop and just say, look, let's just look at the Bible. Let's just look like the story of Zane Hodges, if you ever want to read one about someone who stepped away for the sake of the gospel, and at faithalone.org, you can read all about that. Dr. Bob Wilkin, they are another example of excellence in Biblicism. They will show you the weaknesses, the fallibilities, even the futility of Arminianism. They'll show you the fallible elements of Calvinism and do it with great scholarship. But it's a lot of work, though. And if you're not a Biblicist, so what I'm helping you all with in this class is, yes, people have to be Calvinist or Arminian or Lutheran or Molinist if they don't do their own study. Now, how many people in that point 12 in the list of key features in Biblicism will produce their own theological formulation directly from the Bible and build that from scratch? Not very many people. So again, until I was reached in 1987 by Biblicists, those who were missionary Baptists, Landmark was the name they asserted, the original meaning, go back to original meanings, go back to that which is always the meaning, always the understanding. And then missionary, evangelistic as they were, disciple making, and then to assemble as faithfully as they have, and then teach me about the prevalence of the Lord's churches, and then to go out and do the Great Commission. It was quite impressive to notice among them people who would say, well, I'm not a Calvinist nor an Arminian, and to find people among them say, I'm not young or old earth. First time Dr. Penn told me he wasn't young or old earth, it was not a surprise. And the first time I realized that none of them accepted that any one of these terms of itself was a representative of the whole or the total of that which creationism involved. Pre or post regeneration faith, you remember that one, or the Bible. What does the Bible say? Well, we learned that the gospel first, the finite verb believe was next. That's G4100, and then we found the participle. So unless you're a Biblicist or you're in a class like this, you won't even bother to look that up and notice that. I don't consider it a bother. I actually want to know what the text says. But when you have an either or, does faith precede or does regeneration precede faith? And you all as Biblicists know, first, what's that word faith? Have we discussed that? Did we define that? Is that a verb? Is that a noun? And then where is the relationship of regeneration? We're fathered through the gospel, 1 Corinthians 4:15. We notice in John 20:31 we have believe and believing. That's in the King James English Bible, the well-established, it's the well-known English text. So they demonstrated their knowledge of, even in the King's language, if you will, the Old English, they don't have believeth in that text. And in 1 John 5:1, you notice that they use believeth in that text when it is the one who is believing, always believing. That's a participle. And it says the one who's always believing keeps on believing, persists in believing, is the one who had previously been fathered out from God and is always being fathered out from God. That's a finite verb there, by the way. So, perfect tense. But unless you're a Biblicist, you have to banter, back and forth about all you can say is you prefer faith before regeneration, and all they can say is they prefer regeneration before. So you really won't have a Bible conversation with people who've been primed. You all have learned that. You have people have all this stored priming where they were told, now you remember regeneration precedes faith, and that they just repeat it. Where I pastor, I've now been there. If you're faithful and you stay on the field and you work and labor in word and doctrine, give yourself continued to the word of God in prayer, and then I a church member of the church. That's a great advantage for a pastor. I enjoyed reminding them that I stepped up when others stepped down, stepped in when others stepped out, I stepped up in to compensate for what those who were highly compensated failed to do on their service for the church. And that's not unusual. As a consultant, we find organizations very commonly find them not serving stakeholder interests. So it was an honor to be there. But to persist in teaching and knowing so that they can understand. I mean, by being there as long as I have, someone tried to ridicule me for not being a Calvinist. Of course, he would have struggled to spell the word ridicule, but that's what you expect. And then it would swing to where you're a Calvinist. And so I knew that they had not come from a background in which they had a pastor who was a Biblicist, someone who worked this out and would demonstrate the excellence in Biblicism. So I noticed first, as we're trained in consultation, professional consultant training, especially trained in ministerial practicalities, it was really something how much the pastors at the seminary would teach us what you'll expect on the field. But we were taught in hermeneutics, we were taught in pastoral counseling how to be patient with people, because to know where they're coming from is not a place where subject matter expertise and specialized knowledge is abundant. So that's why we were there training in the first place. And that's why they gave up their lives, to teach us so we could help people. So I couldn't take it personally when people would come in touting old or young or open or closed or pre or post or libertarian or compatibilism. And you can't take it personally, because what else could they be? If you aren't a Biblicist, you have to be these things. And that is even for people, I mean, there's people with advanced education in theology, Bible, literature, languages, and yet they haven't got all this worked out from their own belief system. So, quit mumbling, and I will, and move on. Libertarian or compatibilistic and free will, or the Bible. Bible teaches causal agency, so I've let you all know that if you ask me about free will, I will define it from the Bible. But notice free will, most people don't know free is from freo, 13th century, exempt from. They don't know if will is from boule or thelema, desire. That couldn't be possibly known when it was developed in the English language around the 15th century this phrase came along. So you be patient with them. And of course there's people who have so over-invested their lives in free will. All they really are saying is they are for or against it. They have no interest in understanding it or even knowing of that of which they speak. As Paul said, there are those who have no knowledge of that which they adamantly affirm. So that's not an indictment. Those of you in this class, I've already assured you and give you a heads up that people won't necessarily, because over here, and I'll just draw this. Is funny. I think this is hilarious, and I have to admit it. Over here, you remember the pre and post trib, or the Bible. You remember the 1 Thessalonians 4, 4:17 particularly, where the bodily return of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, and the simultaneous seize away of those who are alive. All that's one event there. Now, this is where I've said the only controversy in rapturism is the difference between the invisible, sudden, imminent evacuation, if you will, of the called out ones, or are we talking about the visible bodily final return? So now there's dispensationalists out there that have sorted that out and they've separated that, but remember, you won't find people that notice the difference between the visible or the invisible. And in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, all that's one event. So I do know online you can find that there are people who make that really clear. Now, I didn't say that's the solution. There's a lot more to be resolved in issues of eschatology with preterism, historicism, futurism, and then those who just advocate idealism or spiritualism. It's just, it would help, and some of you now are learning to help others in your disciple-making process by asking, are you talking about the invisible, secret, imminent, unannounced evacuation of the called out ones? Because that's a reward. That'd be the first thing to get their attention, is because if you're not faithfully assembling as a covenant community in a covenant body, then really don't know what the benefits thereunto appertaining, how a person lays claim on that, which is very much ecclesiastic. So let's wrap this up very quickly. But here's what you'll get. Now they're not happy over here. You know, they're kind of angry at each other. These sides, you know, if you listen to them, they're really angry. Now, and they're against this one's against this one, and that's like partisanship, Republican versus Democrat. Don't expect that the argumentation and the banter and the emotion reflects study in political science, right? Well, you come over here and you'd think, wow, the solution would be great. No, here's what happens. Here's the Biblicists here, and this is what I told you all you'll get. And it's just like the Baptist. If you read their history in Martyr's Mirror, they were persecuted by Catholic on one side and Protestant on the other side, which was the Reformed Catholics. Now, that's just what state religion does. Now, that doesn't happen in this country. Now, it did early in our history. You can read about that. But you just get, here's what happens. Their faces don't improve. They don't get happy. They The only thing that changes, and then I'll stop because this is funny. I just want to help you out because they do this. They both join sides. Now, remember in language, we studied that there was the Pharisee and the Sadducee, and later in the gospel accounts, the Granville Sharp rule, where the noun that precedes the conjunction that has a definite article followed by a noun that doesn't, the anarthrous, and you've already lost your crowd by now. But for those of you using this, you remember that later in the Gospels, their banter between Pharisee and Sadducee was set aside because their entire system was at stake. And they knew that if we don't do something about this Jesus, I would say he was a Biblicist, then all will be lost. So they just turned it on here. So you ever read the history of Baptists, it's actually a history of double dissonance. It's a history of being in the middle. And when we come to this country, and other countries have freedom of religion, I don't mean to say only the United States, but in this country, for example, there's so many different kinds of expressions of faith, religious traditions. It's like I wouldn't even know how to argue with people who say they're Protestant or Catholic, Judaic, Islamic, occultic, New Age, or any denomination, because they don't know either. And to think that someone who's Republican or Democrat might be a student of political science is never a thought that occurs to people. Well, it doesn't often occur to Biblicists that just because someone identifies with the culture of their upbringing or their birth or their raising or their preferences, that it corresponds to anything actual knowledge of the Bible. So have a blessed day, but just remember, if you keep saying, well, why is everyone always this or that or this or that or this or that? Well, there's just so few Biblicists out there. And if you're not a Biblicist, you have to pick from the options that are afforded you. But don't forget, there's people that are Biblicists out there practicing online, very ardent scholars, devoted scholars, faithalone.org. You can go to Soteriology 101 to see an example of someone who even developed their own ism, provisionism. So if you're against that, then I'm sure Calvinists are in an awkward spot. How do we ridicule someone that has their own acronym provide when we have our own tulip? Because some of the Calvinists I know are too scholastic to not have developed their own. Because I often think, what would it be like if Dr. James White developed and produced his own theological formulation directly from the Bible from scratch? What would his look like with his scholastic aptitude? But when you commit the act of construct appropriation, you kind of have to, go home with the one you went out with, I guess. So once you marry yourself to Calvinism, you also get all the liabilities and all the fallible components and features of it. So have a blessed day. Enjoy this. But unless you're a Biblicist, you have to be these other things. And if you want to see excellence in Biblicism, then we have plenty of videos on why neither of these fully reflect, and even the numbers, just so brilliant how the Bible is, when it's all brought together in a holistic approach, like Dr. John Penn teaches in his holistic hermeneutic approach, it all just works to a greater outcome, especially greater than the sum of its parts, because the outcome of work in Biblicism far surpasses the abridged. That's it. That would be as kind as I can be. The very abridged, very limited attempts at some of these fallible constructs. So have a blessed day.